Well, here we have one of my favorites, Clammy Clamshell, if you will, this 1972 Pontiac Grand Safari. Now, the Grand Safari was Pontiac's top-of-the-line wagon for 1972 and came with a whole host of features, certainly had many more that were optional. But this particular 1972 Grand Safari is in beautiful condition. Most of these wagons were rode hard and put away wet, as most people say, and in this case, well, this vehicle is just immaculately preserved. Now, the clamshell wagons were offered by GM from 1971 to 76, and they were called the clamshell wagons because, as you'll see in a minute, the rear doesn't have a swing-out door or fold-down tailgate. The glass as well as the rear door just kind of evaporate before your eyes as you operate them, leaving a completely open area back there. But before we talk about the rear of this clamshell wagon, let's talk a little bit about the front and the front end styling. 1972 was the second year for the clamshell wagon here for Pontiac as well as its sister divisions. And this was also the beginning of the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards for bumpers. And so versus the 1971 model, Pontiac, I think, had to blunt the front end a little bit here to put this bumper in front of it. There's a 2.5 mile per hour impact standard in the front in 1972. It would go to 5 miles an hour in the front in 1973, 5 miles an hour in the front and rear in 1974. But this is still a good-looking front end, at least to my view, despite the unfortunate bumper. That bumper, by the way, would get a lot bigger for 1973. Now, this car has a front end that I would say you could only do on a car like this that is absolutely huge and 80 inches wide. And why do I say that? Look at how many ins and outs and creases and fillets and radii there are on this hood as well as the header panel in front of the trapped hood design that you see here. You start with the top of the fender. Let's start at the driver's side. Then you have a valley kind of as the hood begins. Then you have an eyebrow and a crease above the headlamps. Then it dips back down again into a filleted surface where you have the prow of the hood forming a bit of the Pontiac arrowhead in the sheet metal, as it were. Then a crease down the middle, and then the entire thing repeated on the passenger side, obviously, for symmetry. So it's one of the most complicated front ends of General Motors cars for 1971 to 76. Probably very challenging to stamp. I have to imagine that there were at least like 5 or 6 die strikes on this hood in order to get it formed in this particular manner. And by the way, that's something that you just never see today anymore because one of the main metrics that automakers are focused on is the number of strikes that it takes to form the sheet metal. So this would just be far too many strikes for automakers to put something like this into production today. And that's frankly why you don't see it. You see pretty simple forms overall. Now, one of the things I also love about this front end is I'll call it a double W front end. A lot of front ends during this time period and back in the 1960s had the so-called W front end, where the peaks of the fenders, if you looked at it from a plan view or bird's eye view above, formed kind of the legs of the W, and then the midsection or the hood formed the middle point. But here you've got, I'll call it the double W, because you also have a crease over top of the headlamps. And that area where the crease kind of starts to fall over the front end is actually sitting proud of the headlamps. So you have plan view tapering actually 3 times on this car. On the driver's side, over top of the headlights. Then you have it on the hood, in the midsection of the hood, where you have that prow of the hood that comes together. And then you have the same on the headlamps for the passenger side. Very complex surfacing on this car. Now, as we rotate to the side, the unfortunate part about the beautiful front end on this car is that there's not so complicated surfacing on the body side. In fact, it's relatively simple, particularly the doors, which the station wagons by this point that General Motors was producing had the sedan-style doors with the header on them. They did not make hardtop wagons by this point. General Motors had stopped that in the late 1950s. And that's unfortunate because the hardtop wagons from GM, Chrysler, whomever you pick, were pretty awesome. But again, by this point, everybody was building wagons with the sedan-style doors. And they really don't have all that much that's intriguing about them. Of course, you do kind of have this undulation in the sheet metal. The fender form kind of goes up and then down into the door, and then you can see that at the rear door, there's another form that starts and it kind of kicks up to form the rear quarter panel there. But aside from that, the body side is just pretty standard. And I guess one good thing being a Grand Safari, you've got this beautiful faux wood grain on the side. Amazingly, the faux wood grain on this car is actually in good shape. It's fake and it's basically a glorified decal. So a lot of times they ended up just cracking from age or being out in the weather. Not so on this car. Now here's another view of the side, kind of a front three-quarter view, let's call it. And you can see this is in a little bit better light. You do have some surfacing on the top of the door where the fender kind of blends in, and then the rear door where that kick up for the quarter panel really starts. But one of the interesting things I will point out about these clamshell wagons is the Grand Safari rode atop 127-inch wheelbase, the largest wheelbase of all Pontiacs. The Bonneville and the Granville at this point were riding atop 126-inch wheelbases during this time frame. Pontiac in a few years would actually consolidate the number of wheelbases just to one for the full-size cars, so they rode atop 124-inch wheelbase. But at this point, like I said, the Grand Safari was the longest wheelbase Pontiac, and you had all the wagons for GM that were based on the, I'll call it, most senior and expensive cars, and consequently they got the long wheelbase. The opposite of this was Ford, where if you got a wagon, no matter if it were a Ford or a Mercury wagon, it rode atop 121-inch wheelbase. It rode atop the Ford wheelbase. So basically the Ford wagons were riding atop the cheap car wheelbase. The GM wagons were riding atop the expensive car wheelbase. So you got basically a Olds 98 Buick Electra wheelbase on your Pontiac here, so you got some extreme value. If you got a Mercury Colony Park, which would have been the competitor to this particular Pontiac wagon, you ended up getting effectively a Ford LTD wheelbase. And now let's rotate around out back to the clamshell area, the coolest part of these cars. Look at that wraparound rear quarter glass. Oh my goodness. Now, as I mentioned, the cool thing about these clamshells was that the glass went up into the roof and then the rear door went underneath the car. So you had this completely open area that you could load different items into. Now, the unfortunate part, I think this was a love-hate relationship that people had with this wagon. Some people loved it, some people hated it. Because the great thing was, like I said, it was a completely unencumbered load floor. The unfortunate part was that because of the overall slope of the glass and how much smaller the roof is versus the overall vehicle itself, the glass has some significant curvature to it. And so if you raised it in a rainstorm, all of your kind of loading area is getting wet, as opposed to if that roof were pulled back toward the rear of the car. But hey, if you're a designer, you got to make the car look good, right? And speaking of look good, you have a rare Pontiac with vertical tail lamps here. There were Pontiacs that had those, but in 1972 on full-size vehicles, this was the only full-size Pontiac that had the vertical tail lamps. The Bonnevilles, Catalinas, Granvilles all had horizontally oriented tail lamps. And I'm guessing that was probably just done because the tail lamp would had to be integrated into the rear door there. And that was probably something that would have been more costly to execute than just putting the tail lamps where they are. Now, this is a clamshell wagon that has not only a power-operated glass section at the top, but also a power-operated lower door. There were both styles on these clamshells. There was a manual door. You always got the power window that moved up into the roof. But on some of these clamshells, you had the door, which was manually operated, that you'd have to raise. And the way that you can tell those is by two things. One, on the keyhole, there are two little tabs that you would twist to unlock the door. And then there's a little handle on the door so that you could pull it up. And it was counterweighted, so it wasn't all that heavy. The interesting thing was there was a switch so that you could not activate or drop the door unless the glass had already been raised about 6 inches on those vehicles. Otherwise, it just wouldn't do anything. So a little interesting bit of trivia for you that most people don't know is, like I said, they actually had clamshells that had a power door like this one and then also a manual door. And in this shot, you really get to see what I mean about how your groceries or whatever you were loading would get wet if you had that glass open and the door down, because the roof is just so far forward on this that if that glass is open and it's raining, well, everything's getting wet inside. It's unfortunate, but it looks great. I think for a wagon, it looks great. And you notice here in the roof panel, there's a little step up aft of the rear door. And that's because, as we're going to see as we turn into the interior, these had an interesting kind of seating scheme in them, in that the rearmost third seat actually faced forward. In the Fords, you got seats that would face toward each other. In other GM wagons, you get seats that would face out the rear door. But in the Clamshell, every seat faced forward. So you had to have enough room in the rear for appropriate headroom. And it's interesting, the leg room is really in front of the rear axle. So you'll see that the passengers in the third row seat are sitting atop the rear axle and having their feet kind of just in front of it. But again, a great wagon from a look standpoint, I must say. And now let's transition inside. So for Pontiac's most luxurious wagon, you got these all vinyl bench seats in this particular case. There were different seat styles that were available. This was certainly a very common one. Most individuals liked vinyl because it was very durable, easy to clean, etc. GM never really had something like Ford had on their wagons that Ford called DuraWeave on the Ford wagons, which was effectively a woven plastic. It wasn't cloth. It looked like cloth, but it was basically plastic fibers that were woven together. And the DuraWeave has kind of a rough hand to it if you run your hand over it, but it is extremely durable, and it's comfortable, and it breathes, as opposed to vinyl where, if it's a hot day, this car does have air conditioning. Notice the crotch cooler vent there in the glove box door. But your back's going to get sweaty, and it's maybe not as comfortable. Regardless, the Grand Safari was using a lot of the items from the Bonneville, the Granville, and the full-size Pontiacs all had the same instrument panel that you see here. And I do think that one thing's a bit unfortunate, and that is you can tell that GM's starting to cut costs on the interiors by this point. That instrument panel is not really all that glamorous, nor are the door panels. This car doesn't have the optional power windows. It has the crank windows, but that isn't something that necessarily affects the overall aesthetics of the interior. I think that the interiors in this era for GM were just not as good as the previous generation. One thing you did get is a lot of seatbelt buckles, because you not only have the lap belt, which you see, but you can't see it in this picture, but overhead there was a shoulder belt as well. So you got a lap and a shoulder belt buckle for the driver and passenger, and then you have the lap belt for the middle seat passenger. So lots of buckles hanging around. And by the way, they are heavy. And if it's a hot day, you will burn yourself because they would just get to be very, very hot. I'm curious, does anybody else have that memory of GM cars or other cars of yesteryear burning your hands on the seatbelt buckles, or even if you go to start it and it's been in the sun for a long time, burning your hand trying to start the car on the tabs on the lock cylinder? Just something that I always remember. Sometimes I actually end up having to do that if I've parked my classic car out in the sun. Now, shifting to the rear seats, you notice that you have the bench seat that's the first bench closest to the front seats, and then you have the third row seat, which, as I mentioned, you're basically sitting atop the rear axle. And notice that seat isn't all that thickly padded, in part because they needed quite a bit of headroom. As I mentioned, they'd already bumped the roof panel up. But I wonder how it is to ride back there. I've never actually ridden in the third row seat on a clamshell wagon. I suppose it's probably fine overall, despite the relatively thin bottom cushion. But, this was GM's differentiator for this particular variant. And one of the things that was also interesting, you're riding atop of the rear axle, as I mentioned, but they had changed the rear suspension in this generation from the previous one. This clamshell wagons have rear leaf springs. The previous generation have coil springs in the rear. And GM tried to sell that as though they did that so that you could load up the wagon better and the rear end wouldn't squat as much if you were towing a trailer, as an example. I think it was really for cost, and they were trying to figure out a way to sell that to customers. Just like Chrysler always had seemingly rear leaf springs during this era and the torsion bars up front. Actually, that was something Chrysler had all the way back to 1957. And here, by the way, is the famous clamshell opened up. Notice that the keys are in the lock cylinder, and you'd kind of twist it to operate the clamshell of the hood. One other thing that wasn't necessarily great about these was that notice that the window, because the rear glass wraps around so much, that opening wasn't that wide. So I don't believe you're fitting a 4x8 sheet of plywood in your clamshell wagon, which probably angered some customers. Of course, I'm sure the designers said, how often does somebody use that? Let's make it look cooler. But I think that opening being so narrow was something that did kind of tick off a few buyers. But some people, I think, really enjoyed the fact that, like I said, there was no tailgate to drop down here or door to swing out. Ford had the dual action tailgate that did exactly what I mentioned. GM would eventually go to that style on the next generation wagon after this that began in 1977, copying Ford. Now, let's turn to under hood. And what is lurking underneath the hood here? Actually, a pretty interesting engine. Well, what do I mean by that? You say it's a Pontiac 455, which is great, the largest displacement Pontiac V8 that Pontiac made. By the way, all Pontiac V8s from 326 to 455 cubic inches are the same physical size. The only way you can really tell them is by decoding them with the code that is underneath the cylinder head that's stamped into the block on the passenger side of the engine. But the cool thing about this, and yes, I think this is cool, is that this is a 455 with a 2-barrel carburetor. Ooh, yes, that's right. You got standard in your Grand Safari, a 455 cubic inch V8, but it only came topped with a 2-barrel carburetor. It made 185 horsepower. You could get an optional variant with a 4-barrel carburetor that I believe made 220 horsepower. So somebody's going to say, a 455 with a 2-barrel carburetor, what in the world is going on? Yes, for a period of time, particularly in the early 1970s, a lot of GM divisions had big blocks with 2 barrels. So you had this from Pontiac. Oldsmobile had a 455 cubic inch 2-barrel. Buick even had a 455 2-barrel all the way, I think in 1974 they had that, and they were the only division by that point to have it. Every other division, if you got the 455 by that point, had a 4-barrel on it. But during this time frame, you could get big blocks with 2-barrel V8s, and so that's what the owner got here. And of course, your question is, how did that work? Does it drive well? I got to be honest, they drive great. You don't necessarily have the same top-end power, obviously, as the 4-barrel, but they're not wheezers. They'll pull, and they have great torque. The 2-barrel carburetor, the Rochester 2GC in these, is extremely reliable. It flows about 500 cubic feet per minute of air. So it's not that small of a 2-barrel. It's a pretty big 2-barrel, and let me just tell you, it's a pleasant engine. I have a 1971 Mercury Marquis that has a 429 with a 2-barrel on it. And that one's also pleasant, but the Ford Autolite 2100, despite being a great carburetor, is a bit of a wheezer at the upper ends. And the 2-barrels from GM, if you drive cars with them, they're not nearly the wheezers, I would say, that the Fords and the Chryslers are with their 2-barrel carburetors. So if you find a GM car of this era with a big block and a 2-barrel, don't shy away from it. And frankly, please don't change it to some Edelbrock manifold or whatever. I mean, these cars are never going to be fast compared to today's cars. So just enjoy the car for what it is. And I got to be honest, I think that they're set up just great. So what do you think of this Grand Safari? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Thanks again for watching.